Welcome, everyone. It's good to see a lot of new faces. We do quite a bit of programming here on Asia, and that's my job. I'm director of the Asian Studies Center here, Walter Lohman. But we probably don't do enough on this set of issues, and so I see a lot of folks I don't usually see when we're talking about South China Sea or Taiwan or the number of other security and economic issues. So for my part, I commit to do more on this topic and hopefully to see more of you all here. Before we get started, I have the obligation to do one administrative thing, which is to tell everyone to turn off their cell phones, or at least put them on mute so they don't interrupt the program, and also to point out that we're live streaming online, and that online viewers can submit questions via the internet to our panelists if they're so moved. We're here today to talk about a very serious thing, that is the People's Republic of China's very well-known One China policy, and the devastation that it's wrought on the people of China. Individual women and children, especially girl children, and really on the future of China. I'm going to leave it to the experts here to talk about the details of the issue. I just want to say at the outset that as a full-service Asian Studies Center, we care about these issues as much as we do everything else, and as I say, we plan to do more about it. This issue in particular is important to us, not because it's a venue for us to beat up on China, which I know I will have a hard time convincing my friends from the Chinese embassy of that fact, but we're not trying to beat up on China or gain any sort of geopolitical or ideological advantage or some sort of economic advantage vis-a-vis the PRC. I, for one, am happy to see China grow and prosper and to see its people doing so much better today than they did under Mao Zedong so many decades ago. We focus on issues such as these human rights issues and the one-child policy in particular, because in addition to promoting American interest, we care very much about the Chinese people and their liberty. It's just that simple. I want to thank Reggie Littlejohn and her organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers, for working with us to develop today's program and for co-hosting it with the Heritage Foundation. I also want to thank someone who's not here on Heritage staff, Olivia Anos, research assistant in our Asia shop, for all the work she did on it. She's enjoying herself on vacation, but wasn't able to be here. But she's really the force on our staff that made it all happen. And Sarah Torre, a policy analyst in our DeVos Center, who was a partner in developing the idea and putting it together with Reggie and her organization. To get the discussion started today, we're honored and pleased to welcome the best friend we could possibly have on Capitol Hill in the struggle against the one-child policy, Congressman Chris Smith. This is Congressman Smith's 17th term in the House. He's a real leader on the full range of human rights issues. He's a senior member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, and he's chairman of its Africa Global Health, Global Human Rights, and International Organizations Subcommittee. That's a heck of a long name for a subcommittee. Congressman Smith is also co-chair of the Congressional Executive Commission on China, having served as its chairman during the previous Congress, as is the process for that organization. With that brief introduction, I want to welcome Congressman Smith to the stage and hear his remarks.
Walter, thank you very much, and good afternoon to everyone. Just a few brief points. I just ran into Lee Edwards, who I haven't seen in a long time. We worked on a number of issues, particularly religious freedom. And we were talking about he's going to be in Romania very soon, and it was Richard Wurmbrand's book, Torture for Christ, that got me involved in religious freedom issues. And, you know, people talk about the dysfunction of Congress. Well, it reached a low point the other day. There was a debate on the floor of the House about religion, and the Republican said to the Democrat, "I'll bet you can't even recite the Lord's Prayer." Well, the Democrat said, "I'll take your bet," and a $20 bet was made. And the Democrat folded his eyes and said, "Now I lay me down to sleep. I pay the Lord my soul to keep." And then the Republican reached in and took out his 20 and said, "I didn't think you knew it." Walter, thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Reggie, to this very important meeting and this panel discussion, you know, this is a very serious subject, unbelievably so, and too often is neglected by Washington and by other capitals, by the White House. So thank you for having this very important discussion. Ladies and gentlemen, China's one-child policy, announced in 1979, is state-sponsored violence against women and children, including and especially the girl child, and constitutes massive crimes against humanity. The Nuremberg Nazi War Crimes Tribunal properly construed forced abortion as a crime against humanity. It was employed against Polish women mostly, and nothing in human history, however, compares to the magnitude of China's more than 34-year assault on women and children. Abortion is a weapon of mass destruction. Hundreds of millions of lives have been exterminated. Today in China, rather than being given maternal health care, pregnant women without birth-allowed permits are hunted down and forcibly aborted. They are mocked, they are belittled, humiliated, and exploited. A mother has absolutely no right or legal standing to protect her unborn baby or herself from this state-sponsored violence. There are no single moms in China, except those who somehow evade the family planning cadres and conceal their pregnancy. Many of them have their pregnancies or live through it on the run, going from place to place. Beijing's one-child policy bans single moms from obtaining government permission to carry the child to term. For more than 3 decades, most brothers and sisters in China have been illegal. The price of failing to conform to the one-child policy is staggering. A Chinese woman who becomes pregnant without a government permit will be put under mind-bending pressure to abort. She knows that out-of-plan illegal children, imagine that, illegal children, are denied education, health care, and marriage, and that fines for bearing a child without a birth permit can be 10 times the average annual income of 2 parents, and those families that can't or won't pay are jailed or their homes are smashed. If the brave woman still refuses to submit, she may be held in a punishment cell, or if she flees, her relatives may be held and very often beaten. Group punishments will be used to socially ostracize her. Her colleagues and neighbors will be denied birth permits. If a woman is by some miracle still able to resist this pressure, she may be physically dragged to the operating table and forced to undergo an abortion. Her trauma is beyond comprehension. It is a trauma she shares in some degree with every woman in China whose experience of intimacy and motherhood is colored by pervasive fear. A report released in September of 2012 by the Chinese Center for Disease Control and Prevention, yes, they have a CDC, as do we, but their CDC stated there is a staggering 590 female suicides per day in China. Not week, month, per day, 590. China is the only country in the world where female suicide rate is higher than that of males. And according to the Beijing Psychological Crisis Study and Prevention Center in China, the suicide rate for females is over 3 times higher than for males. Over the years, I've chaired almost 50 congressional hearings, human rights hearings, focused in whole or in part on China's one-child policy. 4 of my hearings were focused on the great Chen Guangcheng, the self-taught lawyer who defended women from this vicious policy. And what a price he paid. Jail, beatings, torture. Guangcheng testified once in person and twice by phone from his confinement in a Chinese hospital after his heroic escape. I know of no other person on earth who has personally suffered so much for attempting to stop this cruelty to women. He is a hero. Reggie Littlejohn also appeared at my hearings and each time provided incisive testimony and, importantly, a plan of action. Reggie and her organization, Women's Rights Without Frontiers, has courageously and tenaciously defended the women of China, challenging the government of China itself, but also the governments of the United States and other European nations that ought to be doing far more than they're doing, NGOs and the UN, to cease their enabling and their complicity in these crimes. Chai Ling, one of the heroes of Tiananmen Square, has also been amazingly effective. Ling founded a group called All Girls Aloud that seeks to protect the girl child from gendercide, has testified numerous times as well, and has rescued over 1,000 girls in China from sex selection abortion. Over the years, my committee has also received testimony from numerous victims. Wu Jian, a Chinese student attending a U.S. university, testified about how her child and other children were murdered by the government. She said, and I quote, "The room was full of moms who had just gone through a forced abortion. Some moms were crying, some moms were mourning, some moms were screaming, and one mom was rolling on the floor with unbearable pain." Then Wu Jian said that it was her turn, and through tears she described what she called her journey in hell. Sometimes those who commit these crimes are remorseful. A woman who ran the forced abortion program in Fujian province escaped China, and she told my committee in the 1990s that she was a monster, her word, monster, by day, and compelled women to abort even in the 9th month of pregnancy, despite pleadings and tears from the mothers. Although haunted by it, she said she carried out her duty with, quote, resoluteness. Women, as we know, bear the major brunt of the one-child policy, not only as victimized mothers. Due to the male preference in China society and family size limitation, the policy has directly contributed to what is accurately described as gendercide, the extermination of the girl child in society simply because she happens to be a girl. As a result of the Chinese government's barbaric attack on mothers and their children, there are tens of millions missing daughters in China today. Because of the missing daughters, China has become the human sex trafficking magnet of the world. Women and young girls from outside the country are being sold as commodities throughout China, a direct consequence of the one-child policy. Some of you may know I'm the author of the landmark Trafficking Victims Protection Act of 2000, the comprehensive landmark law to prevent trafficking, prosecute traffickers, and protect victims from modern-day slavery. One provision of the law requires an annual assessment of every country. The TIP report, the TIP report, last year said, in pertinent part, China's birth limitation policy, coupled with a cultural preference for sons, creates a skewed sex ratio in China, which served as a key cause of human trafficking of foreign women as brides for Chinese men and for forced prostitution. The report went on to say the number of foreign women trafficked to China is definitely rising and will continue to rise because of the dearth, the lack of women who have been slaughtered through the one-child per couple policy. Recently, an op-ed in the People's Daily, the official newspaper of the Chinese Communist Party, shed light on the worsening demographic nightmare that is China. The article titled, "Leftover Men to be a Big Problem," admits there is a bachelor's crisis that will trigger a moral crisis of marriage and the family, and that the continual accumulation of the number of unmarried men will greatly increase the risk of social instability. At another congressional hearing that I chaired, Brigham Young University professor Valerie Hudson, author of a book called Bare Branches, The Security Implications of Asia's Surplus Male Population, testified, and I quote, that by the year 2020, young adult bare branches ages 15 to 34 will number approximately 23 to 25 million. The foremost repercussions will be an increase in societal instability, marked increases in crime, crimes against women, and the formations of gangs. She went on in her testimony to say it will even raise the specter of war because the instability will be so profound. And Japan is one of those countries that would be in the crosshairs where they could unite nationalistic views in order to take the pressure off what they have created through this one-child per couple policy. Nicholas Eberstadt, I spoke to him yesterday. He's on his way to Asia for a speech on North Korea. The world-renowned demographer has said, what are the consequences for a society that has chosen to become simultaneously more gray, Obviously, a graying society, fewer children, older people are in ascendancy, and more male because of the lack and the missing daughters. In her book, Unnatural Selection, Choosing Boys Over Girls and the Consequences of a World Full of Men, another woman who has testified at our committee, before my committee, Mara Wiesenthal writes, and I quote, "There are over 160 million missing females from Asia's population." Now, that's not just China, but it's all of Asia. Many of them are missing in China. And that's about equal to the number of women and girls living in the entire United States of America. On a visit to China, Vice President Joe Biden told an audience that he was well aware of and fully understood the one-child policy and that he was not, quote, second-guessing the state for imposing it. Can you imagine what the public reaction would be if the Vice President said he fully understands and is not second-guessing copyright infringement and gross violations of intellectual property rights? The one-child-per-couple policy is the most egregious, vicious attack on women ever. For the Vice President of the United States to publicly state he fully understands the one-child policy and won't second-guess it is unconscionable. Although the Vice President attempted to modestly backtrack when he got back to the United States for that extremely callous remark, his voting record as a senator shines a spotlight on his long-held disregard for the severity of human rights violations in China. On September 13, 2000, he joined 52 other senators in defeating an amendment by then-Senator Jesse Helms, condemning the one-child policy. Then Senator Biden reportedly did so because he was concerned that condemning China on fundamental human rights would interfere with the normalization of trade relations. And that same argument was used by Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on her first trip to Beijing. When asked about human rights, she said, "Oh, I don't want to raise those issues. I don't want them to interfere with global climate change talks as well as talks on selling U.S. debt." I also asked Secretary of State Hillary Clinton at a hearing whether she or President Obama raised the issue of forced abortion in China directly with Hu Jintao when he was in town in Washington. She refused to answer it, said she'll get back. The record is still open and still no response. Before or since, there is nothing in the record to suggest that President Obama has ever raised the plight of Chinese women being compelled to undergo abortion with who, Xi Jinping, or anyone else. So much for the cheap sophistry of choice. Finally, I respectfully submit that not only is the Obama administration turning a blind eye to the atrocities being committed under the one-child policy, but it is even contributing financial support, contrary to U.S. law, to the United Nations Population Fund, or the UNFPA. 30 years ago, we have a packet, and we included the actual amendment and the debate as it occurred. On May 9, 1984, I authored the first amendment ever to a foreign aid bill to deny funding to organizations such as the UNFPA that are complicit with China's forced abortion and involuntary sterilization policies. It did pass. Jack Kemp and Senator Bob Caston made it law. The Kemp-Caston amendment today remains part of the foreign ops law, yet under Obama it has not, I repeat, not been taken at all seriously. Under Presidents Reagan, Bush, and Bush, Mr. Obama, unlike them, thus far has provided $227 million taxpayer funds, grant money, to the UNFPA, an organization that supports, plans, implements, defends, and maybe for international audiences, this is most important, whitewashes the Chinese government's brutal program. On one of several trips to the Beijing, I can't get a visa anymore ever since I tried to go and visit Chen Guangcheng, but on previous trips, one in the 1990s, I challenged Peng Peiyong, the woman who ran the program for 10 years in China, travels freely all around the world. She's talking about women's rights. She ran the forced abortion program. And her response to me, it was a multi-hour meeting, continually came back, but the UNFPA is here. They give us a clean bill of health. There is no coercion according to the UNFPA. So they have enabled these atrocities against women, and that makes them complicit. And when we fund it, that makes us complicit. Finally, in 2000, I wrote a law It's called the Admiral Nance Meg Donovan Foreign Relations Act of 2000 and 2001. Section 801 of Title 8 of that act requires that the Secretary of State not issue any visa to, and the Attorney General not to admit to the United States any foreign national whom the Secretary finds, based on credible and specific information, to have been directly involved in the establishment or enforcement of forced abortion or forced sterilization. We included in the handout. Owing to a glaring lack of implementation, approximately 18, a handful of abusers have been denied visas to the United States. The next president has to do a better job. Thank you for having me here, and look forward to any questions. And,
Great, thank you, thank you. That was a very powerful statement, very powerful statement. Thank you so much for that. It's a good setting for the rest of the discussion. To continue that discussion, we've got two guests. One, Reggie Littlejohn, who I've mentioned before, our co-host of this event, and then a special guest who you've all already recognized, Chen Guangcheng himself. He really doesn't need an introduction from me. I think the applause on the way in indicated maybe you recognize him. But you know, the one thing I will say, and then I will just give you some idea of what he's doing right now, but the one thing I will say is it's so good to have him on the stage to talk about the one-child policy, because I don't know if you know it, Mr. Chen, but when you were sequestered at NYU, we were told that you didn't really care about this issue. I mean, there was a big debate, and a lot of people said it wasn't really something that you cared about. And at the time, we weren't able to hear much from you directly. And now you're here on the stage proving your commitment to the issue. So I'm really glad and honored that you could be with us today. Chen Guangcheng is now distinguished senior fellow in human rights at the Simon Center on Religion and the Constitution. He's also a member of the faculty at Catholic University and a senior distinguished advisor to the Lantos Foundation for Human Rights and Justice. As you know, he was a human rights or civil rights lawyer in China, and his imprisonment lasted a good 4 years before even house arrest. We followed your story very closely in 2012, and were riveted to the television, finding out what was going on with you, and so glad you made it here safe and sound. I hope all is well with your family as well back in China. So with that, let me turn the podium over to Mr. Chen, and he can speak to us. Thank you.
嗨，大家好。刚才史密斯先生谈到了很多，我首先呢要感谢史密斯先生还有瑞杰女士在我被中共迫害的时候所做出的呼吁，还有大家各位的关心，再次表示感谢。
Yeah, Honorable Representative Smith talked a lot about what his observation and the fact and the wrongdoing of the Chinese Communist Party in regarding the one-child policy. And I'm especially thankful for Mr. Smith and Ms. Littlejohn for their support during my difficult years in prison as well as under house arrest in China.
感谢所有为中国人权做出努力的人。
I thank all of you who support the China human rights cause.
根据我个人的经验呢，我在2005年在我们那个地区所做的调查当中，这10几万被强迫堕胎和结扎的民众当中，我几乎没有听到谁是自己愿意的。
Yeah, during my 2005 personal investigation in China in my neighboring native county and neighboring countries, that there are over 100,000 women who had abortion, and none of them said they were willing to do so.
几十年的这种暴力寄生呢，实际上让整个中国国民生活在恐惧当中。
And after several decades of one-child policy implementation and mostly forced abortion, that China actually, the public live in an atmosphere of scary and the fear from the government.
长期以来呢，中共就给中国人民这样一种印象，就是他通过各种手段告诉中国人民，有关计划生育的问题没有道理好讲，也没有讲理的地方，他们想怎么做，你必须服从，必须接受，否则你就会面临更大的麻烦和迫害。
And through all these years of policy implementation and propaganda that the Chinese Communist Party want the Chinese people and the public know that they have to follow their orders in family planning policy or one-child policy implementation. Otherwise, you will suffer and pay huge price for what they call the violating that kind of rules.
刚才史密斯先生讲到的株连的问题，在中国直到现在仍然在进行。也就是说，如果有一家人有计划生育的问题，他的邻居都会受到株连都会被抓走、被酷刑这个数字的比例是非常强大的。我05年调查的时候，可能是60多万人被株连。
And my numbers show that as many as 650,000 people, including neighbors and relatives whose member were suffering the forced abortion, which is really what Mr. Smith has said during his speech, that's a horrible crime against the Chinese people. And I think that I'm going to provide a little bit more later on.
这个政策的存在呢，不仅破坏了中国传统的这种人命关天、尊重生命的这种概念，而且让这个社会现在视人命如草芥，对于生命的蔑视非常的普遍，对于社会道德的破坏，对于社会道德的沦丧，起到了一个非常严重的破坏作用、推动作用
And actually the China's one-child policy implementation and its propaganda have demoralized the Chinese society and switching from a society which value life so much to a kind of social decay that they look down and they have a kind of contempt to the individual life of human being there.
在中国这种暴力之下呢，其实很多妇女是欲哭无泪，根本没有地方去诉说。有的家庭由于躲避这种暴力寄生而遭到严重的殴打。
And in many cases, that women find hopeless and in facing the forced abortion, and they have, dry their tears, and their neighbors and the relatives often suffer beaten from the local government officials to implement such a kind of inhuman policy.
我只给大家举一个例子，在我们邻村有这样一个家庭，他们因为所谓的违反中共的这个一胎化政策，而又拒绝被他们抓走去强制堕胎，那么结果呢，这个中共政府呢就把他们夫妻2个全都抓到车上，然后在途中还没有到达医院的时候，把她的丈夫从车上拖下来有7、8个这个壮汉对她实施严重的暴打。
And I can give you an example that I know in my neighboring village, one couple and the wife was pregnant without permit and was requested by the local government to go abortion, but she refused, and both couple refused to go there, and later on they were just taken over by the thugs and the local government officials on a truck. But during the trip and before they arriving at the clinic, and the husband was taken off the truck and beaten on the ground.
然后又把他拖上车带到医院就是强制他的爱人做堕胎手术，然后把他们2个送回家。
And after the beating, the husband was putting back on the truck and bring the couple to the clinic for a forced abortion, and then they bring them back home.
然后他们2个人每个人躺在一张床上，就没有人照顾他们，然后计划生育的官员就全部都走掉了，就这样痛苦的躺在家里。
And the
后来
couple
他
were
们去
left
寻
at
求我的
home
帮助。
homeless, without anyone taking care of them after suffering beating and forced abortion.
这样的案子只是千千万万当中的一个。由于这种长期的恐惧呢，每当这种计划生育运动来临的时候，这些中国的这个百姓就不敢住在自己的家里。
And this is just one of those tens of thousands of examples who suffer such a kind of inhuman treatment in China. And whenever there's a kind of family policy implementation planning ordered from the above government, and the neighbor and the villagers, they were so scared they dare not to live in their own houses.
所以每天晚上他们就带着自己的这个像被子呀什么，就跑到野外去住在田地里。这样呢，这个计划生育的官员就不能堵着他的家门把他们抓走。如果他们发现他们晚上开着车来抓他们，他们就好在田野里奔跑。
And actually, so they had to escape their own home to bring a few clothes and to stay overnight in the open field to escape the grab from the local family planning policy officials.
那么这种状态实际上跟战争状态也没有太大的区别。
So this seems like in a war zone.
这种中共对所有的媒体下达禁令关于从92年就有这样一个命令，就是中宣部有这样一个命令，关于计划生育的任何侵权问题不准报道。
And actually, even with such a horrible event happening everywhere and every day, the Chinese Central Propaganda Department issue notice and policy said the media cannot touch this kind of things since 1992.
每当这样的运动开始的时候呢，党委中共党委书记就会直接出面要求公安、检察院和法院等司法部门不能介入有关计划生育的任何案件。
And actually, whenever this happened, the party chief, which is the boss in China at all levels, and they order the police department and the court system not to touch this kind of cases.
所以在这种情况下呢，就完全处于一种就是无法无天的状态。
So in this case, there's no law at all, whatever, in place.
说到这儿呢，我想展开谈一下中国的人权问题，实际上是非常非常严重的一个对人类文明价值摧残的这样一个问题。
And now that I want to talk a little bit about what kind of effect of the Chinese human rights to the overall human civilization.
从中共夺得权力以来呢，实际上他就是做了2件事情，一件事情就是攫取利益，另一件事情就是实行暴力。那么始终在这2件事情当中来回的循环。
And ever since the Communist Party took power, it seemed that there are only 2 things happening at the same time. One is the power elite grab wealth, and through violence, and with violence they rule the country.
所以从一开始为了政权而打击这个不同意见的，结果最后是文化大革命。
And for the power grab that they fight against each other, which lead actually to the happening of the horrible cultural revolution, which start from 1966 to 1976, actually.
那么80年代为了金钱、贪污腐败，那么有这些知识分子、学生出来抗议的时候，最后导致了是89民运这种天安门镇压。
And during their grab for wealth and material benefits in the 1980s, which had caused huge corruptions in Chinese society, and that's also the reason why the student took to the street in 1989 to demand freedom and democracy, and which had a bloody crackdown by the Communist Party.
这件事情呢，就好像是中共对所有的这个中共干部说啊，有人民民主专政做你的后盾，你就尽管贪污腐败吧。
It seems to me that like the Communist Party calling for its elite, ruling elite, that with the what they call people's authoritarian dictatorship back you can do whatever to grab the wealth and power and being corrupted officials the way they are now.
所以89年之后呢，我们看到那个腐败从贪污几万元到现在的几百亿、上千亿啊。
And we can see the corruption is getting even worse on an even more large scales from the 1980s, with perhaps about $10,000 or yuan or dollar.
元。
Okay, 10,000 yuan, which is literally maybe a few $100s at that time, to today's millions of dollars, which is in Chinese yuan by billions. Good.
那么到现在为止呢，这些中国的民众也在要求他们公示财产，那也就是说，要求他们廉洁已经没有希望了，就要求他们公布他们官员的财产，那么也受到了强力的打压。
And now that the people has no hope to see a clean government, and the least they want to do is that the government let the public know their wealth, the personal wealth of those officials.
我特别想跟大家说的一件事情就是，中共并不代表中国。中共也并不代表中国人民。从某种程度上讲，中国共产党现在是站在了人民的对立面上，与中国人民为敌。我希望大家都能清楚地认识到这一点。
I want to emphasize here that everybody should realize that the Communist Party does not represent China, and not even mention the Chinese people. It is just now they becoming a public enemy of the Chinese people.
共产专制的存在对人类的威胁，比恐怖分子严重不知数万倍。我们对此我觉得认识还不够，将来的威胁会更大。
And I believe that we have underestimated the threat from the communist regime like China. They are many times more dangerous than the terrorist group out there. And I believe that people will realize later this is true.
即使在中国传统当中有这样一句话说啊，我的家风可进，雨可进，国王不可进。那么也就是说，你即使是国王，封建王朝的，他也不可能管到你家里。可是现在共产党就可以不仅管到你家里，他可以把手伸到你的身体里，把你的孩子掏出来。
And in Asian Chinese culture, we have a saying said that your home is your castle, and even the king will not be allowed to come in without my permission. But now in today's China, under the communist rule, that they even put their hand into your body and grab your babies out of your womb.
而且当着你的面把他杀掉。
And they kill your babies in your face.
所以在这种情况下，我觉得我们必须站在中国人民一边，把共产专制送入历史。
And in such a situation that we, people of conscience, must stand up with the Chinese people to end the communist in China.
谢谢大家。
Thank you very much.
Thank you for those remarks. I want to now just briefly introduce Reggie, because I think most of you already know her as well, but in case you don't, she's co-founder of Women's Rights Without Frontiers. She's a good friend of the Heritage Foundation and a regular partner of ours. Her international coalition is specifically dedicated to exposing and opposing forced abortion, gendercide, and sexual slavery in China. She's well known in the pro-life community as a fierce advocate. She most recently received the National Pro-Life Recognition Award in 2013. So with that, let me turn it over to Reggie.
Congressman Smith, Chen Guangcheng, Walter Lohman, distinguished guests, Women's Rights Without Frontiers is truly humbled to partner with the Heritage Foundation in this event, and we thank Heritage for your very generous hospitality. But I also would like to just give a very personal thanks to Congressman Chris Smith. As you know, he has been the fiercest advocate for Chinese human rights in the U.S. Congress. He had 4 hearings and just tirelessly advocated for the release of Chen Guangcheng, and I have no doubt that Chen Guangcheng would not be sitting at this table right now if it were not for Congressman Chris Smith. And on a more personal note, Congressman Chris Smith also played an extremely critical role in bringing over the daughters of Zhang Lin, who I'll be telling you more about later, but I am now raising them, my husband and I are raising them as our own children, and if it weren't for Congressman Chris Smith, we would not have our 2 Chinese daughters. So he is a very important friend of our family. And of course, Chen Guangcheng is my greatest hero. I began advocating for him at the European Parliament in 2008. And actually, Heritage Foundation played an important role in the freedom of Chen Guangcheng at an event that was organized by Nick Zahn, and right here in this space, another human rights activist, Bob Fu, and I spoke. This is when Chen was languishing in the hospital room. We didn't know whether China was going to let him go and whether the United States was going to take him in, and Nick Zahn organized a huge media conference, and the word about him went all over the world, and that was a big part of the international campaign to free Chen Guangcheng. So thank you to Heritage for that. Few issues divide more sharply than abortion. Long-standing friendships and even family relationships rupture over the pro-choice versus pro-life debate. But on the International Day of the Girl Child, which is coming up on Saturday, can pro-choice and pro-life at least agree about 2 things? Number 1, forced abortion is not a choice. And number 2, the murder of females just because they are females is wrong. For most of us, "It's a girl" is a cause for enormous joy when we hear that at the birth of a child. But in fact, the words "it's a girl" are the deadliest words on earth when said at the birth of a child. According to one UN estimate, up to 200 million women are missing in the world today due to gendercide, the sex-selective abortion or abandonment of baby girls. The Terracotta Daughters exhibit, is that up? Okay, good. The Terracotta Daughters exhibit, recently on view in New York this month, gives a dramatic visual form to the girls who've been lost through sex-selective abortion. The haunting stares of an army of the dead. On September 18th, 2014, just a few weeks ago, it was reported that a student at Linyu University gave birth to a baby girl in the toilet and just abandoned her in the pipe of the toilet. This is not a pro-choice or pro-life issue. This is a human rights issue that must be approached as an area of common ground. No one supports the systematic elimination of women and girls. Furthermore, forced abortion is not a choice. The Chinese Communist Party, whom I think Chen Guangcheng accurately says does not represent the Chinese people, but in fact has become the enemy of the people, has boasted that it has prevented 400 million lives through the one-child policy. That is greater than the entire population of the United States and China combined. Each one of these 400 million lives prevented is a victim of communism. This is the hallmark of communist regimes, the peacetime killing of their own citizens. So I would like to play a video now called "Stop Forced Abortion, China's War on Women." because I feel that it really dramatizes and brings home what women are going through in forced abortion in China. I'm a litigation attorney, and in the 90s, I represented a client who had escaped China. I represented her in her case for political asylum in the United States, and she had been forcibly sterilized. That was my introduction to the reality behind the one-child policy. In fact, China's one-child policy causes more violence against women and girls than any other official policy on earth. I call it China's war on women and girls. When I say forced abortion, I mean women are literally dragged out of their homes or off the streets. They can be jailed in family planning jail cells, forced to abort children that they want. And this can happen all the way up to the 9th month of pregnancy. Some of these forced abortions are so violent that the women themselves die along with their full-term babies. One case that I'll never forget is of a young woman who was 7 months pregnant without a birth permit. So that would be an illegal pregnancy, who was walking down the street, and she was grabbed by family planning cadres, dragged off the street, strapped down to a table, forced to abort the baby that she very desperately wanted. And in the end, one of the medical personnel came to her with the body of her aborted baby and said, "You need to pay for this so that we can dispose of the body." And she said she didn't have any money, so they just laid that body right next to her in the bed. And I've got a photograph of her looking down and just grieving the loss of this 7-month-old baby that was forcibly aborted. It does not matter whether you are pro-choice or pro-life on this issue. No one supports forced abortion because it's not a choice. And this violence must stop. My goal in establishing women's rights without frontiers is to end forced abortion and sexual slavery in China. And to that end, I have testified before Congress, I've addressed the European Parliament, briefed the White House. When I started this several years ago, no one was talking about the one-child policy. And now, because of the documentation that has been generated, two things have happened. Number one, the Chinese Communist Party cannot deny that the one-child policy is enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and infanticide. And number two, it seems that almost everybody is talking about it at this point. It's become a household issue. Stop the violence. End China's war on women. Forced abortion is not a choice. So just to give you an idea of the magnitude of this issue, the 400 million figure that we quote is actually a Chinese Communist Party number. That's the number that they cite as how many lives have been prevented. They also say that they have about 13 million abortions a year. That comes out to approximately 25,000 a day, or almost 1,500 an hour. So in the time that we will be speaking here, there will be at least 1,500 women who are aborted, most of them forcibly, in China. You might have heard that China has eased its one-child policy. This is not true. These atrocities continue to this day. Every couple of years, China makes a minor exception. They tweak the policy in some way or another, and the Western media presents this as that they have eased or even abandoned the one-child policy. Most recently, on January 1st of this year, the Chinese Communist Party made a very small modification, which they said if one member of a couple is an only child, that couple can have a second child. That only affects, according to their own demographers, about 10 million couples. And also, that it doesn't matter whether the Chinese Communist Party is allowing people to have one child or two children. What matters is that they are telling people how many kids they can have and that they are enforcing that limit through forced abortion. They have not stopped the coercion, and the coercion is the core of the policy. More often than not, gendercide is not a choice either. There is a strong correlation between sex-selective abortion and coercion, crushing social, economic, political, and personal pressures in cultures with a strong son preference trample women carrying girls. Too often, women in these cultures do not select their daughters for abortion. They are forced. So what I'd like to do now is I'd like to show the 3-minute trailer to a 63-minute documentary. The documentary is called It's a Girl. You can get it on Netflix, and it is the authoritative documentary on gendercide in India and China. And we showed this film at the European Parliament, the British Parliament, with the help of Congressman Chris Smith. We showed it here on Capitol Hill. But all I'm going to do is show you the first 3 minutes. I would urge you to watch this entire film. Ooh. I guess that didn't make it. Can we have the It's a Girl trailer? Okay, here we go.
Today, India and China eliminate more girls than the number of girls born in America every year.
The definition of genocide is a systematic and methodical extermination of a certain group. And the gendercide is that systematic and methodical extermination of a gender group.
Why are Indian households secretly and brutally eliminating daughters from their family system?
They just bend the cloth and they fold it like this and they put it on the face so the child can't breathe. Immediately the child will die.
But what this is an entire system, a social machinery that says we don't want females.
But the real problem started after I became pregnant. They started asking me for a sex determination. They wanted to know if the children are girls or boys. They started torturing me to get an abortion done. What should I do to save my daughters?
कि उसके सिर हिला के देखा तो वो तो यहाँ पे गले पे पूरा निशान पड़ा हुआ है। निशान पड़ने के बाद तब हमें फिर रोना पीटना, हमारे तो होश ही उड़ गए थे लड़की को देख के, इसने मार कैसे दी।
如果按计划生育生的话，我就只能生2个。哎呀，反正在村子里都有专人搞这些工作的嘛，就被他们知道我们在那里。
மனசுல அது வச்சிருக்க கூடாது. பையனா இருந்தா வச்சுக்கலாம், பெண்ணா இருந்தா வச்சுக்கலாம். அப்படி இப்படி பிடிச்சா தேர்வு கத்து. இப்போ பிறந்த உடனே நானே உபாசிப்படுவேன். மறுபடியும் பையனே இல்லை அப்படின்னு 8 குழந்தைங்களாட்டம் கொண்டு விட்டோம்.
In both China and India, women are pressured strenuously to abort their baby girls, even up to death. Between China and India, we have 1/3 of the population of the earth. The one-child policy in China, gendercide in China and India, these together are the biggest women's rights, in fact, the biggest human rights issues in the world today. In China, these are, okay. In China, these slides are from demographer Nicholas Epperstadt, so I'm grateful to him for providing those to me. The birth ratio of boys to girls is the most skewed in the world. The sex ratio at birth has risen from 108.5 in 1982 to almost 118 boys born for every 100 girls born in 2010. And this has to do with a confluence of the one-child policy coming together with the availability of ultrasound so they can determine the sex of the child and the availability of abortion. When you put the three of those together, you get serious gendercide. So, the unintended consequences of the one-child policy. You have forced abortion, forced sterilization, infanticide. The coercive low birth limit leads to gendercide, the sex-selective abortion of baby girls, which has led to a gender imbalance. There are 37 million more men living in China today than women, which is in turn driving human trafficking and sexual slavery. People sometimes ask, how do the women of China deal with this? The answer is quite sobering. China has the highest female suicide rate of any country in the world. 590 women a day end their lives in China. So China's one-child policy causes more violence against women and girls than any other official policy on earth and any other official policy in the history of the world. This is the true war against women. The one-child policy is also causing what I call a senior tsunami. So this is a graph, again, by Nicholas Epperstadt, of the fact that the working population in China peaked in 2013 at about 73% and is now beginning a steady decline to 67% in 2030. Meanwhile, the aging population is on a steep rise. In fact, the ratio of China's population ages 55 to 64 to its population ages 15 to 24 will increase from about 30% in 1990 to 140% in 2030. So what is China going to do? China is clearly growing old before it grows rich. I would submit to you that China does not have a population problem other than the true population problem in China is not that they have too many people, but they have too few young people and too few women. These are the population problems in China. Finally, a medical study from China has revealed an additional way in which women are victimized by the one-child policy, which is a significantly increased rate of breast cancer. There was a meta-analysis done of many studies together in China, and what they found is that induced abortion is significantly associated with an increased risk of breast cancer among Chinese females, and the risk of cancer increases with the number of induced abortions. Specifically, the study found that one induced abortion increases a woman's breast cancer risk by 44%, 2 by 76%, and 3 by 89%. So a woman who's had 3 induced abortions has an 89%, almost double the chances of getting breast cancer as a woman who has not had any induced abortions. The study quote says that China has had the lowest low breast cancer rate when compared with Western nations, but the, quote, incidence of breast cancer in China has increased at an alarming rate over the past 2 decades. The study notes that this rise was paralleled to the one-child per family policy. So, in addition to the trauma of a forced abortion at the time and losing your child, and, you know, people ask me how I got involved with this. I've had a couple of miscarriages, and I think that that sensitized me to the pain of women losing children. I think that if that had not happened, maybe I would not have been so passionate about this issue. But in addition to the pain of losing their child in incredibly violent circumstances, which is one of the greatest human rights violations in the world, 20 years, 30 years down the line, the woman might also lose her life due to breast cancer. So breast cancer becomes a human rights violation in itself when it has been caused by a forced abortion. So it is a woman's right to choose to give birth to her children, and including her daughters. These problems are not confined to China and India. There are, even in California, there is evidence that there is elevated sex ratios at birth among certain populations. So this has come to the United States, it's come to Canada, it's come to the UK. But fortunately, there is hope. Women's Rights Without Frontiers has 2 ways of addressing this issue. The first is we have an international advocacy campaign where I've spoken at various parliaments, Congress, White House, the Vatican, all over the world, raising the visibility of this issue, addressing the fact that the West is in some sense complicit with this through the financing of the UNFPA and International Planned Parenthood, both of whom have been working hand in hand with the Chinese Communist Party in the implementation of this policy since its beginning. And then beyond that, we have something that we call our Save a Girl campaign, where we have a network on the ground in China. And we have field workers who will find out when a woman has had an ultrasound, she knows she's pregnant with a girl, and has scheduled herself for an abortion, or who has given birth to a girl and is being pressured to abandon that baby girl, or who is in such dire straits of poverty that the life of her daughter is really at risk. And then we will go to her door and we will say to her, please do not abort, please do not abandon your baby just because she's a girl. She's a precious daughter. And we have an overwhelming success rate and have saved about 120 girls so far. So we have a very, very effective Save a Girl campaign in China. And I have some, okay. So these are some of the baby girls that we've saved. A lot of these are second daughters. In the countryside, when the first daughter is a girl, they can have a second child, and a lot of people regard that as their last chance to have a son, and so then they will selectively abort their baby girls. And this is a boy that we saved from forced abortion. His mother was running from village to village, and we were able to just get her money every month so she could survive, and then gave birth to this beautiful baby boy. And then lastly, we are living our mission in our own home, and with the help of Congressman Chris Smith, Jing Zhang, Hu Jia, many brave souls from the United States and China, we were able to get these 2 girls out of China. The younger one, Annie, is known as China's youngest prisoner of conscience. Her father, Zhang Lin, is a very celebrated pro-democracy activist in China. He's been jailed and tortured multiple times because of his activism. When they couldn't silence him through jailing him and torturing him directly, they actually went to Annie's school and kidnapped her when she was 10 years old. She was called to the principal's office. 4 unidentified men whisked her away. She was detained overnight, and then she was denied the right to go to school. When her father stood up for her, he was detained, and so he got word out to me saying, Annie, and I would like Annie to come to the United States. She can't lead a normal life in China. And so through, again, Congressman Chris Smith and others, we were able to get her and her sister over to the United States, and we are now raising them as our daughters. So. Chen Guangcheng is a shining example of the fact that people who try to stand up against this policy from Chinese soil get jailed and tortured. They cannot stand up for themselves because there is no freedom of speech in China. So those of us who know what's happening, like myself, like all of you now, we have a moral obligation to stand up against this atrocity. Every struggling mother in China and India deserves to keep her child and also deserves not to be pressured to selectively abort her daughter. Together, we can end forced abortion and gendercide and sweep these atrocities against women into the dung heap of history, which is where they belong. Thank you.
Thank you, Reggie. We're going to have time for one or two questions here from the audience, depending on their length. We're a little bit over time. But I just wanted to say one thing and then ask a question myself of Reggie. The first thing is that I'm really glad that you used the phrase "war on women" because I'm not sure after hearing it in that context how anyone could use it in any more trivial context. We're so comfortable in this country that we throw things around like that. I mean, it really puts things in perspective to hear it in the context that you talk about it. The other thing I wanted to do, just ask you this question, and I don't mean to divert the conversation away from China, but you talked about India, and I wonder if you could just contrast the problems a little bit between India and China. My sense is that there is a similar cultural preference in both countries for boy children, but that the nature of the problem is very different. That is, in China, the problem is the involvement of the state and the coercive nature of it. In India, it may in fact be the opposite. That is, the lack of the state's effectiveness and ability to address the problem. But I wonder if you could just contrast those two.
China and India are similar in the sense that they both have son preference. And the reason that they have son preference is that when a couple marries, the young woman goes over to the young man's family, and that couple supports his parents in their old age. So when you have a place like China and India where they don't really have Social Security, they really are depending on their sons to support them in old age. So some people might feel like they have the choice between committing sex-selective abortion or poverty in their old age. And there's a saying in China and India that to raise a girl is to water somebody else's garden. Now, the difference between China and India is that China has this state-enforced coercive low birth limit. So when we're talking about a forced abortion, we're talking about the government coming and breaking down doors and dragging women out and strapping them down to tables and forcibly aborting them. When we talk about gendercide, we're talking about pressure from the family, which China and India share, to abort or abandon a baby girl. And India has the additional pressure of the dowry system. Dowry is officially illegal in India, but it's still practiced all over the place. And what a dowry means is that when a young woman grows up, her family has to give a large amount of money or resources to the boy's family. So when you're pregnant, you find out you're carrying a girl, you know that 20 years from now, you're going to lose a lot of money. And if it's a boy, you're going to gain a lot of money. So that is a very economically driven decision in terms of whether you're going to carry a pregnancy to term. But as between dowry and coercive low birth limit, the sex ratio at birth in India is around 112. And in China, it's more like 118, 119 boys born for every 100 girls born. So the coercive low birth limit is a much stronger driving force for gendercide, even than the dowry system.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't mean to divert, but I think that's an important distinction to make between the two situations. That is the role of the state,
right?
And its coercive nature, and it's undemocratic and it's undemocratic nature. Let me open it to questions. Yes, right in the front row. We got a microphone for you. And could you identify yourself,
Sure.
please?
My name is Mark Strickers. I'm with Alatea. Deng Xiaoping enacted this policy 34 years ago. Why are conservatives, maybe Americans more generally, objecting to the policy so strenuously now?
Well, just very quickly, I don't think it's a recent phenomenon. Congressman Smith referenced Jesse Helms' crusade on this issue for many years, but maybe it's intensified. I'll let Reggie address that.
there were a few real champions that were trying to show what was going on with the one-child policy, Congressman Chris Smith being probably the main one in the West. But against that is the whole Chinese propaganda machine. They have a propaganda department. And the propaganda went out that the coercive enforcement of the one-child policy was a thing of the past, and it was all voluntary now, and that was what I was facing in 2008. The first thing I had to do in 2008 was convince people that this was actually happening, so we got in all this documentation out of China to demonstrate that it is still happening, that there's still enforced through forced abortion, forced sterilization, and infanticide, and it wasn't, and that, I think, really helped the campaign to bring awareness. And then, of course, Chen Guangcheng has done more than anyone else to bring documentation, and then his own personal sacrifice. And I also should say the sacrifice of his wife, Yuan Weijing, she has also been tortured. She is equally a hero with him. And I could go on about his family, his mother, his brother, his nephew, who is currently in jail. The Chen family, I believe, is going to make a huge pivotal difference to the history of China. But his case did not come out until just a few years ago when he was jailed. The fact that he was jailed gave a huge amount of visibility to this issue, and I think that that's why there's been more recent attention to it.
Thank you. Yes, one more.
I'm Penny Starr with CNS News. You ended, Reggie, by saying people need to take a stand. What can be done? You said that the U.S. government, and Congressman Smith said the government, in its opportunities to negotiate with China, we don't know whether this is being addressed. But what can we do?
Well, there's a couple things. Number one, we have a petition online to sign against forced abortion. Congressman Smith and I tried to deliver this petition to the Chinese embassy last year. We were refused. We could see them walking around in there, but they wouldn't let us in. But at least that raised the visibility of the issue. Raising the visibility of the issue is very important to building the political will to end it. People can support the Save a Girl campaign if you want to save individual lives of girls. And then in terms of the most effective ways of combating the UNFPA and International Planned Parenthood, I'd like to defer to Congressman Smith if he's still here. And, Congressman Smith, would you like to address that question?
Microphone's coming to you. Oh, either way. Yeah.
It's a great question. And the question about the 80s, 90s, and why this new attention, the liberal left has trivialized this issue. I remember in the mid-1980s, after pushing hard with the amendment that I offered and then Kem Kasten, the Democrats put together a hearing because they were going to debunk, this is 1984, 85, that this is a real problem. And they brought in some Foreign Service officers who testified and said, oh, that it is all crested. The high tides, as they called it, of 1983 are over. They have gone and scoured the country. And on the record at a hearing, they said, this is all ancient history. My word, but their sentiments. We have run into that. And then Michael Weitzkopf in the Washington Post did a 3-part front-page expose for which he should have gotten the Pulitzer Prize, but it didn't, that really got into the insights of what was happening. He did it as he was exiting, because any journalist who did it while he was still there would have been persona non grata and thrown out of the country. Stephen Mosher, when he was with Stanford, lost his doctorate. And matter of fact, the Wall Street Journal did an editorial, and by name, they called it Stanford Morality, because he had exposed a horrific crime against humanity, and for that, Stanford was at risk of losing its entree to China, so they would look askance to human rights abuses. That mentality has pervaded and has been persistent over the course of decades, selling out the Chinese women. I'll give you another example. When at the Beijing Women's Conference, and a couple of people here were there, I was there, I led the delegation, and the bottom line was Hillary Clinton wanted to go in the worst way. So I held 4 hearings on the Beijing Women's Conference, led the congressional delegation, and said you can't go unless you raise the forced abortion policy and name China by name. She finally led the delegation, gave a very distant view of, talked about coercion, but did it in a way that was totally non-incriminating of China. I was there in the room, and the Chinese delegate who was up sitting next to her, the leader, who was one of the architects of the one-child per couple policy, was clapping just like everybody else in the room because it had just completely missed the mark by a mile. She still references that and said she gave the Chinese government the what for. And another example, when the Golden Venture ran aground in New York Harbor, many of those women had been victimized by forced abortion and the men by coercive sterilization. Under Reagan, we had a policy, a well-founded fear of persecution, where asylum could be granted to such a person. Bill Clinton reversed it by executive order, and then I tried repeatedly. I held hearings on it. I offered a bill, an amendment, that was vetoed as part of a larger bill, and then Henry Hyde and I snuck it into, not snuck, but did it on a bill that was not, it was a debate, that was not going to be vetoed, and it became law. They were going to send the women of the Golden Venture back to China. And I appealed to Clinton, Mrs. Clinton in particular, and Vivier, who was her chief of staff, to step up. These women have a target on their back. They will go right to the Lao Gai. They may even be executed. And they did nothing to help the women who were then in Bakersfield, California. I brought them in for a hearing. This is the point of the indifference that is gross, and it persists to this day. And I mentioned in my comments about Obama not even mentioning this. We've asked them. We had the 5 daughters, all of whom's fathers are still in prison, except for Gao Zhejiang, who is now out. And one of the daughters, all of them said it, but one of them said it so beautifully. She goes, the president has 2 daughters. He'll understand. Raise our fathers' plights. So on human rights in general, forced abortion in particular, the administration has been absolutely AWOL, and that goes for the Clinton administration as well. They were going to send those women back to a very, very cruel fate, and they were the ones who were victimized by forced abortion. That callousness, and Reggie knows it, my wife Marie, who I've worked with on this issue since I got into Congress. Stephen Mosher broke the story in the early 1980s, 82, 83. If it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have found out for a few years after that. He broke the story. I am appalled myself at the indifference. Where are the women's rights groups on this, other than Reggie and Right to Life and some of the pro-life organizations? They too have been AWOL. And one last thing, we talk about India and China. We had another hearing on India the other day, and some of the leaders who have heavily chronicled, where did this all come from? Sex selection came from this town, from the Population Council, from International Planned Parenthood and Planned Parenthood organizations as a means of population control. They felt it would be a twofer. You kill the girl child while she's in utero, you get rid of one carbon breather. You kill her, she will also not be a mother when she's 20 or 25. Thereby, you mitigate the population so-called problem, a la Paul Ehrlich. So that has, the population mantra has so suppressed the ability to bring light and scrutiny to the coercion in China throughout all of these decades. I know it because I've held so many hearings on it. I've been there. I've raised it repeatedly and offered bill after bill after bill, and as has Jesse Helms and Jack Kemp and so many other great Americans. And yet we still have this indifference. If you ask most people about forced abortion in China, you'll get a blank stare. The media has failed its what should have been its ability to search out and to expose this, but it's not politically correct. Thank
you. Well, unfortunately, we're going to have to leave it there. I thought to somehow second those comments that Congressman Smith just made, but he did them so well, I would just be wasting your time. It is a major problem. That is the way that this town, not just the left, but I would say professional class as well, regards these issues. But let me just take one moment to thank Congressman Smith for joining us today and for giving a very powerful statement. Reggie Littlejohn and Chen Guangcheng. I hope this is just the start of a much more intense focus in Washington on this issue, and we'll do everything we can to keep a spotlight on it. Thank you very much.